Why Buddhism is True: The Science and Philosophy of Meditation and Enlightenment by Robert Wright. Writer, but tell me before you go, what was the worst thing about being down here? Agnes, just existing. Knowing my sight was blurred by my eyes, my hearing dulled by my ears, and my bright thought trapped in the gray maze of a brain. Have you seen a brain? Writer, and you're telling me that that's what's wrong with us? How else can we be? A Dream Play by August Strindberg, as adapted by Carl Churchill. A note to readers. Any book with a title like Why Buddhism is True should have some careful qualification somewhere along the way. We might as well get that over with. 1, I'm not talking about the supernatural, or more exotically, metaphysical parts of Buddhism, reincarnation, for example, but rather about the naturalistic parts, ideas that fall squarely within modern psychology and philosophy. That said, I am talking about some of Buddhism's more extraordinary, even radical claims that, if you take them seriously, could revolutionize your view of yourself and the world. This book is intended to get you to take these claims seriously. Next, I'm of course aware that there's no one kind of Buddhism, but rather various Buddhist traditions, which differ on all kinds of doctrines. But this book focuses on a kind of common core, fundamental ideas that are found across the major Buddhist traditions, even if they get different degrees of emphasis and may assume somewhat different form in different traditions. 3, I'm not getting into super fine-grained parts of Buddhist psychology and philosophy. For example, the Abhidhamma Pitaka, a collection of early texts, asserts that there are 89 kinds of consciousness, 12 of which are unwholesome. You may be relieved to hear that this book will spend no time trying to evaluate that claim. 4, I realize that true is a tricky word, and asserting the truth of anything, certainly including deep ideas in philosophy or psychology, is a tricky business. In fact, one big lesson from Buddhism is to be suspicious of the intuition that your ordinary way of perceiving the world brings you the truth about it. Some early Buddhist writings go so far as to raise doubts about whether such a thing as truth ultimately exists. On the other hand, the Buddha, in his most famous sermon, lays out what are commonly called the Four Noble Truths. So it's not as if the word true has no place in discussion of Buddhist thought. In any event, I'll try to proceed with appropriate humility and nuance as I make my argument that Buddhism's diagnosis of the human predicament is fundamentally correct, and that its prescription is deeply valid and urgently important. 5, asserting the validity of core Buddhist ideas doesn't necessarily say anything, one way or the other, about other spiritual or philosophical traditions. There will sometimes be logical tension between a Buddhist idea and an idea in another tradition, but often there won't be. The Dalai Lama has said, "Don't try to use what you learn from Buddhism to be a better Buddhist. Use it to be a better whatever you already are." Robert Wright. Chapter 1, Taking the Red Pill. At the risk of over-dramatizing the human condition, have you ever seen the movie The Matrix? It's about a guy named Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, who discovers that he's been inhabiting a dream world. The life he thought he was living is actually an elaborate hallucination. He's having that hallucination while, unbeknownst to him, his actual physical body is inside a gooey, coffin-sized pod, one among many pods, rows and rows of pods, each pod containing a human being absorbed in a dream. Probably at least hundreds of thousands of these things. in the movie millions. These people have been put in their pods by robot overlords and given dream lives as pacifiers. The choice faced by Neo to keep living a delusion or wake up to reality is famously captured in the movie's red pill scene. Neo has been contacted by rebels who have entered his dream, or strictly speaking, whose avatars have entered his dream. Their leader, Morpheus, played by Lawrence Fishburne, explains the situation to Neo. You are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, into a prison that you cannot taste or see or touch, a prison of your mind. The prison is called the Matrix, but there's no way to explain to Neo what the Matrix ultimately is. The only way to get the whole picture, says Morpheus, is to see it for yourself. He offers Neo 2 pills, a red one and a blue one. Neo can take the blue pill and return to his dream world, or take the red pill and break through the shroud of delusion. Neo chooses the red pill. That's a pretty stark choice. A life of delusion and bondage, or a life of insight and freedom. In fact, it's a choice so dramatic that you'd think a Hollywood movie is exactly where it belongs. That the choices we really get to make about how to live our lives are less momentous than this, more pedestrian. Yet when that movie came out, a number of people saw it as mirroring a choice they had actually made. The people I'm thinking about are what you might call Western Buddhists, people in the United States and other Western countries who, for the most part, didn't grow up Buddhist, but at some point adopted Buddhism. At least they adopted a version of Buddhism, a version that had been stripped of some supernatural elements typically found in Asian Buddhism, such as belief in reincarnation and various deities. This Western Buddhism centers on a part of Buddhist practice that in Asia is more common among monks than among lay people. That is meditation, along with immersion in Buddhist philosophy. Two of the most common Western concepts of Buddhism, that it's atheistic and that it revolves around meditation, are wrong. Most Asian Buddhists do believe in gods, though not an omnipotent creator god, and don't meditate. These Western Buddhists, long before they watched The Matrix, had become convinced that the world as they had once seen it was a kind of illusion. Not an out-and-out hallucination, but a seriously warped picture of reality that in turn warped their approach to life, with bad consequences for them and the people around them. Now they felt that. Thanks to meditation and Buddhist philosophy, they were seeing things more clearly. Among these people, The Matrix seemed an apt allegory of the transition they'd undergone, and so became known as a Dharma movie. The word Dharma has several meanings, including the Buddha's teaching and the path of the Buddhists that they tread in response to those teachings. In the wake of The Matrix, a new shorthand for I follow the Dharma, came into currency. I took the red pill. I saw The Matrix in 1999, right after it came out, and some months later I learned that I had a kind of connection to it. The movie's directors, the Wachowski siblings, had given Keanu Reeves 3 books to read in preparation for playing Neo. One of them was a book I had written a few years earlier, The Moral Animal, Evolutionary Psychology and Everyday Life. I'm not sure what kind of link the directors saw between my book and The Matrix, but I know what kind of link I see. Evolutionary psychology can be described in various ways, and here's one way I had described it in my books. It is the study of how the human brain was designed by natural selection to mislead us, even enslave us. And don't get me wrong, natural selection has its virtues, and I'd rather be created by it than not created at all. Which, so far as I can tell, are the two options the universe offers. Being a product of evolution is by no means entirely a story of enslavement and delusion. Our evolved brains empower us in many ways, and they often bless us with a basically accurate view of reality. Still, ultimately, natural selection cares about only one thing, or I should say, cares, in quotations, about one thing. Since natural selection is just a blind process, it's not a conscious designer. And that one thing is getting genes into the next generation. Genetically based traits that in the past contributed to genetic proliferation have flourished, while traits that didn't have fallen by the wayside. And the traits that have survived this test include mental traits, structures and algorithms that are built into the brain and shape our everyday experience. So if you ask the question, what kinds of perceptions and thoughts and feelings guide us through life each day? The answer, at the most basic level, isn't the kinds of thoughts and feelings and perceptions that give us an accurate picture of reality. No. At the most basic level, the answer is the kinds of thoughts and feelings and perceptions that helped our ancestors get genes into the next generation. Whether those thoughts and feelings and perceptions give us a true view of a reality, strictly speaking, beside the point. As a result, they sometimes don't. Our brains are designed to, among other things, delude us. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Some of my happiest moments have come from delusion, believing, for example, that the tooth fairy would pay me a visit after I lost a tooth. But delusion can also produce bad moments, and I don't just mean moments that, in retrospect, are obviously delusional, like horrible nightmares. I also mean moments that you might not think of as a delusion, I think of as crazy or delusional, such as laying awake at night with anxiety, or feeling hopelessness, even depressed for days on end, or feeling bursts of hatred toward people, bursts that may actually feel good for a moment, but slowly corrode your character, or feeling bursts of hatred toward yourself, or feeling greedy, feeling a compulsion to buy things or to eat things or drink things well beyond the point where you're well being served. Though these feelings of anxiety, despair, hatred, greed aren't delusional the way a nightmare is delusional, if you examine them closely, you'll see that they have elements of delusion, elements you'd be better off without. I'd like to add here that basically these feelings we get are often just irrational. That's why they're delusional, because they're not true to somebody who's level-headed and in a good mood, or somebody who is elevated and beyond emotions entirely, someone who sees clearly in the higher states of consciousness. It's not what you see is not what other people see, so there's something delusional about that. And if you think you would be better off, imagine how the whole world would be. After all, feelings like despair and hatred and greed can foster wars and atrocities. So if what I'm saying is true, if these basic sources of human suffering and human cruelty are indeed in large part the product of delusion, there is value in exposing this delusion to the light. Right? Sounds logical? But here's a problem that I started to appreciate shortly after I wrote my book about evolutionary psychology. The exact value of exposing a delusion to the light depends on what kind of light you're talking about. Sometimes understanding the ultimate source of your suffering doesn't, by itself, help very much. An everyday delusion. Let's take a simple but fundamental example. Eating some junk food, feeling briefly satisfied, and then only minutes later, feeling a kind of crash and maybe hunger for more junk food. This is a good example to start with for two reasons. First, it illustrates how subtle our delusions can be. There's no point in the course of eating a 6-pack of small powdered sugar donuts when you're believing that you're the Messiah or that foreign agents are conspiring to assassinate you. And that's true of many sources of delusion that I'll discuss in this book. They're more about illusion, about things not being quite what they seem, than about delusion in the more dramatic sense of the word. Still, by the end of the book, I'll have argued that all of these illusions do add up to a very large-scale warping of reality, a disorientation that is as significant and consequential as out-and-out delusion. The second reason junk food is a good example to start with is that it's fundamental to the Buddha's teaching. It can't literally be fundamental to the Buddha's teaching because 2,500 years ago when the Buddha taught, junk food as we know it didn't exist. What's fundamental to the Buddha's teaching is the general dynamic of being powerfully drawn to sensory pleasure that winds up being fleeting at best. One of the Buddha's main messages was that the pleasures we seek evaporate quickly and leave us thirsting for more. We spend our time looking for the next gratifying thing, the next powdered sugar donut, the next sexual encounter, the next status-enhancing promotion, the next online purchase. But the thrill always fades, and it always leaves us wanting more. The old Rolling Stones lyric, "I can't get no satisfaction," is, according to Buddhism, the human condition. Indeed, though the Buddha is famous for asserting that life is pervaded by suffering, some scholars say that that's an incomplete rendering of his message, and that the word translated as suffering, dukkha, could, for some purposes, be translated as unsatisfactoriness. So what exactly is the illusory part of pursuing donuts or sex or consumer goods or a promotion? There are different illusions associated with different pursuits, but for now we can focus on the illusion that's common to these things, the overestimation of how much happiness they'll really bring. Again, by itself, this is a delusion only in a subtle sense. If I asked you whether you thought that getting that next promotion or getting an A on that next exam or eating that next powdered sugar donut would bring you eternal bliss, you'd say no, obviously not. On the contrary, we do often pursue things, such things with, at the very least, an unbalanced view of the future. We spend more time envisioning the perks that a promotion will bring than envisioning the headaches it will bring. And there may be an unspoken sense that once we've achieved this long-sought goal, once we've reached the summit, we'll be able to relax, or at least things will be enduringly better. Similarly, when we see that donut sitting there, we immediately imagine how good it tastes, not how intensely we'll want another donut only moments after eating it, or how we'll feel a bit tired or agitated later when the sugar rush subsides. So we don't see the whole story. Why pleasure fades. It doesn't take a rocket science to explain why this sort of distortion would be built into human anticipation. It just takes an evolutionary biologist, or for that matter, anyone willing to spend a little time thinking about how evolution works. Here's the basic logic. We were designed by natural selection to do things that helped our ancestors get their genes into the next generation. Things like eating, procreating, earning the esteem of other people, and outdoing rivals. I put designed in quotation marks again because natural selection isn't a conscious, intelligent designer, but an unconscious, or we say a mechanical process. Still, natural selection does create organisms that look as if they're the product of a conscious designer, or a designer who kept fiddling with them to make them effective gene propagators. So as a kind of thought experiment, it's legitimate to think of natural selection as a designer and put yourself in its shoes and ask, if you were designing organisms to be good at spreading their genes, how would you get them to pursue the goals that further its cause or this cause? In other words, granted that eating, having sex, impressing peers, and besting rivals helped our ancestors spread their genes, how exactly would you design their brains to get them to pursue these goals? I submit that at least 3 basic principles of design would make sense. First off, achieving these goals should bring pleasure, since animals, including humans, tend to pursue things that bring pleasure. The next thing is the pleasure shouldn't last forever. After all, if the pleasure didn't subside, we'd never seek it again. Our first meal would be our last, because hunger would never run out, and the craving wouldn't run out. So too with sex, a single act of intercourse, and then a lifetime of laying there basking in the afterglow. There's no way to get lots of genes into the next generation that way. Thirdly, the animal's brain should focus more on the fact that pleasure will accompany the reaching of a goal, and more on this than the fact that the pleasure will dissipate shortly thereafter. After all, if you focus on the first one, that you'll pursue things, if you focus on the idea that it'll give you pleasure, you'll pursue things like food and sex and social status with unalloyed gusto. Whereas if you focus on the second option, you could start feeling ambivalence or ambivalence. You might, for example, start asking what point is of the so fiercely pursuing pleasure if the pleasure will wear off so shortly after you get it and leave you hungering for more. Before you know it, you'll be full of ennui and wishing you'd majored in philosophy. If you put these 3 principles of design together, you get a pretty plausible explanation of the human predicament as diagnosed by the Buddha. Yes, as he said, pleasure is fleeting, and yes, this leaves us recurrently dissatisfied. And the reason is that pleasure is designed by natural selection to evaporate so that the ensuing dissatisfaction will get us to pursue more pleasure. Natural selection doesn't want us to be happy, after all. It just acts in this way to be productive, in its narrow sense of productiveness. And the way to make us productive is to make the anticipation of pleasure very strong, but the pleasure itself not very long-lasting. Scientists can watch this logic play out at the biochemical level by observing dopamine, a neurotransmitter that is correlated with pleasure and the anticipation of pleasure. In one seminal study, they took monkeys and monitored dopamine-generating neurons as drops of sweet juice fell onto the monkeys' tongues. Predictably, dopamine was released right after the juice touched the tongue. But then the monkeys were trained to expect drops of juice after a light turned on. As the trials proceeded, more and more of the dopamine came when the lights turned on, and less came after the juice hit the tongue. We have no way of knowing for sure what it felt like to be one of those monkeys, but it would seem that as time passed, there was more in the way of anticipating the pleasure that would come from the sweetness, yet less in the way of pleasure actually coming from the sweetness. To translate this conjecture into everyday human terms, if you encounter a new kind of pleasure, if, say, you've somehow gone your whole life without eating a powdered sugar donut, and somebody hands you one and suggests you to try it, you'll get a big blast of dopamine after that taste of the donut sinks in. But later, once you're a confirmed powdered sugar donut eater, the lion's share of the dopamine spikes comes before you actually bite into the donut. As you're staring longingly at it, the amount that comes after the bite is much less than the amount you got after the first blissful bite into a powdered sugar donut. The pre-bite dopamine blast you're now getting is the promise of more bliss, and the post-bite drop in dopamine is, in a way, the breaking of the promise, or at least it's a kind of biochemical acknowledgement that there was some overpromising. To the extent that you bought the promise, anticipated greater pleasure than would be delivered by the consumption itself. You have been, if not deluded in the strong sense of that term, at least misled. It's kind of a cruel in a way to think about it, but what do you expect from natural selection? Its job is to build machines that spread genes. And if that means programming some measure of illusion into the machines, then illusion there will be. Unhelpful insights. So this is one kind of light science that can shed on an illusion. Call it Darwinian light. By looking at things from the point of view of natural selection, we see why the illusion would be built into us, and why we have more reason than ever to see that it is an illusion. But, and this is the main point of this little digression, this kind of light is of limited value if your goal is to actually liberate yourself from the illusion. Don't believe me? Try this simple experiment. First, reflect on the fact that our lust for donuts and other sweet things is a kind of illusion. That the lust implicitly promises more enduring pleasure than will result from succumbing to it, while blinding us to the letdown that may ensue. Next, as you're reflecting on this fact, hold a powdered sugar donut or something of your craving and desire 6 inches from your face. Do you feel the lust for it magically awakening or weakening? Not if you're like me, no. This is what I discovered after immersing myself in evolutionary psychology. Knowing the truth about your situation, at least in the form that evolutionary psychology provides it, doesn't necessarily make your life any better. In fact, it can actually make it worse. You're still stuck in the natural human cycle of ultimately futile pleasure seeking, what psychologists sometimes call the hedonic treadmill. But now you have a new reason to see the absurdity of it. In other words, now you see that it's a treadmill specifically designed to keep you running, often without really getting anywhere, yet you keep running. And powdered sugar donuts are just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, the truth is, it's not all that uncomfortable to be aware of the Darwinian logic behind your lack of dietary self-discipline. In fact, you may find in this logic a comforting excuse. It's hard to fight Mother Nature, right? But evolutionary psychology also made me much more aware of how illusion shapes other kinds of behavior, such as the way I treat other people and the way I am, in various senses. The way I treat myself. In these realms, Darwinian self-consciousness was sometimes very uncomfortable. Yangi Mingyur Rinpoche, a meditation teacher in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, has said, ultimately, happiness comes down to choosing between the discomfort of becoming aware of your mental afflictions and the discomfort of being ruled by them. What he meant is that if you want to liberate yourself from the parts of the mind that keep you from realizing true happiness, you have to first become aware of them, which can be unpleasant. Okay, fine. That's a form of painful self-consciousness that would be worthwhile. The kind that leads ultimately to deep happiness. But the kind I got from evolutionary psychology was the worst of both worlds. The painful self-consciousness without the deep happiness. I had both the discomfort of being aware of my mental afflictions and the discomfort of being ruled by them. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. Well, with evolutionary psychology, I felt I had found the truth. But manifestedly, I had not found the way. Or the life. Which was enough to make me wonder about another thing Jesus said, that the truth will set you free. I felt I had seen the basic truth about human nature, and I saw more clearly than ever how various illusions imprisoned me. But this truth wasn't amounting to a get-out-of-jail-free card. So is there another version of the truth out there that would set me free? No, I don't think so. At least, I don't think there is an alternative to the truth presented by science, natural selection, like it or not, is the process that created us. But some years after writing The Moral Animal, I did start to wonder if there was a way to operationalize the truth, a way to put the actual scientific truth about human nature and the human condition into a form that would not just identify and explain the illusions we labor under, but would also help us liberate ourselves from them. I started wondering if this Western Buddhism I was hearing about might be that way. Maybe many of the Buddha's teachings were saying essentially the same thing modern psychological science says, and maybe meditation was in large part a different way of appreciating these truths, and in addition, a way of actually doing something about them. So in August 2003, I headed to rural Massachusetts for my first silent meditation retreat. A whole week devoted to meditation and devoid of such distractions as emails, news from the outside world, and speaking to other human beings. The truth about mindfulness. You could be excused for doubting that a retreat like this would yield anything very dramatic or profound. The retreat was, broadly speaking, in the tradition of mindfulness meditation. The kind of meditation that was starting to catch on in the West that in the years since has gone mainstream. As commonly described, mindfulness, the thing mindfulness meditation aims to cultivate, isn't very deep or exotic. To live mindfully is to pay attention to be mindful of what's happening in the here and now, and to experience it in a clear, direct way, unclouded by various mental obfuscations. Stop and smell the roses. This is an accurate description of mindfulness as far as it goes, but it doesn't go very far. Mindfulness, as popularly conceived, is just the beginning of mindfulness. And it's in some ways a misleading beginning. If you delve into the ancient Buddhist writings, you won't find a lot of exhortations to stop and smell the roses. And that's true even if you focus on those writings that feature the word sati, the word that's translated as mindfulness. Indeed, sometimes these writings seem to carry a very different message. The ancient Buddhist text known as the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, the closest thing there is to a Bible of mindfulness, reminds us that our bodies are full of various kinds of unclean things, and instructs us to meditate on such bodily ingredients as feces, bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, tears, skin oil, saliva, mucus, fluid in the joints, urine. It also calls for us to imagine our bodies 1 day, 2 days, 3 days dead, bloated, livid, and festering. I'm not aware of any best-selling books on mindfulness meditation called Stop and Smell the Feces, and I've never heard a meditation teacher recommend that I meditate on my bile, phlegm, and pus, or on the rotting corpse that I will someday be. What is presented today as an ancient meditative tradition is actually a selective rendering of an ancient meditative tradition, in some cases carefully manicured. There's no scandal here. There's nothing wrong with modern interpreters of Buddhism being selective, even sometimes creative in what they present as Buddhism. All spiritual traditions evolve, adapting to time and place, and the Buddhist teachings that find an audience today in the United States and Europe are a product of such evolution. The main thing for our purposes is that this evolution, the evolution that has produced a distinctively Western 21st century version of Buddhism, hasn't severed the connection between current practice and ancient thought. Modern mindfulness meditation isn't exactly the same as ancient mindfulness meditation, but the two share a common philosophical foundation. If you follow the underlying logic of either of them far enough, you will find a dramatic claim that we are, metaphorically speaking, living in the Matrix. However, mundane mindfulness meditation may sometimes sound, it is a practice that, however mundane it sounds, it's a practice that, if pursued rigorously, can let you see what Morpheus says the red pill will let you see, namely, just how deep the rabbit hole goes. On that first meditation retreat, I had some pretty powerful experiences, powerful enough to make me want to see just how deep the rabbit hole goes. So I read more about Buddhist philosophy and talked to experts on Buddhism, and eventually went on more meditation retreats and established a daily meditation practice. All of this made it clearer to me why The Matrix had come to be known as a Dharma movie. Though evolutionary psychology had already convinced me that people are, by nature, pretty deluded, Buddhism, it turned out, painted an even more dramatic picture. In the Buddhist view, the delusion touches everyday perceptions and thoughts in ways subtler and more pervasive than I had imagined, and in ways that made sense to me. In other words, this kind of delusion, it seemed to me, could be explained as the natural product of a brain that had been engineered by natural selection. The more I looked into Buddhism, the more radical it seemed, but the more I examined it in the light of modern psychology, the more plausible it seemed. The real-life matrix, the one in which we're actually embedded, came to me, it seemed to more like the one in the movie. Not quite as mind-bending, maybe, but profoundly deceiving and ultimately oppressive, and something that humanity urgently needs to escape. The good news is the other thing I came to believe: if you want to escape from the Matrix, Buddhist practice and philosophy offer other spiritual traditions, offer very powerful hope. Buddhism alone isn't this promise. There are other spiritual traditions that address the human predicament with insight and wisdom. But Buddhist meditation, along with its underlying philosophy, addresses that predicament in a strikingly direct and comprehensive way. Buddhism offers an explicit diagnosis of the problem and a cure. And the cure, when it works, brings not just happiness, but clarity of vision, the actual truth about things, or at least something way, way closer to that than our everyday view of them. Some people who have taken up meditation in recent years have done so for essentially therapeutic reasons. They practice mindfulness-based stress reduction or focus on some specific personal problem. They may have no idea that the kind of meditation they're practicing can be a deeply spiritual endeavor and can transform their view of the world. They are, without knowing it, near the threshold of a basic choice, a choice that only they can make. As Morpheus says to Neo, "I can only show you the door. You are the one that has to walk through it." This book is an attempt to show people the door, give them some idea of what lies beyond it, and explain from a scientific standpoint why what lies beyond it has a stronger claim to being real than the world they're familiar with. This and all subsequent daggers refer to elaborative notes that can be found in the notes section at the end of the book.